Low sex drive, hormonal imbalance, fertility struggles, irregular cycles, low energy. These are problems that millions of men and women are trying to solve. Tests, supplements, specialists, plugging in variable after variable, hoping one of them finally balances the formula. But here is the one variable that almost nobody is putting into the equation: how you breathe. Specifically, whether you breathe through your nose or your mouth. This is breath math. We don't guess, we do the math. And when you run the numbers of what nasal breathing actually does inside your body, the connection to your sex drive, your hormones, and your reproductive health becomes impossible to ignore. Today, we will solve that equation. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Breath Math. I'm Nisha, and in today's episode, we are covering something that is fully backed by science and yet almost completely absent from mainstream health conversations: the direct biological connection between nasal breathing and your reproductive and sexual health for men and for women both. This is real anatomy, real neuroscience, real hormonal research, and it all points to one thing that most people have never been told about their own body. No jargons, no discomfort, just a clear conversation about biology that actually matters. This is a two-part episode. Today, part one is the wiring: how your nose is physically connected to your genitals, your hormones, and your desires. Part two next week is the damage and the fix. Let's get into the math. Nitric oxide, the small molecule with a big job. Let's start with something called nitric oxide. You may have heard this term before. And if you have ever heard of Viagra, you have already met nitric oxide, even if you didn't know it. Nitric oxide is a tiny molecule, just two atoms, that your body produces naturally. And one of the biggest production sites for it is right inside your nose, in your sinuses, those hollow spaces behind your cheeks, forehead, and the bridge of your nose. Here is what nitric oxide does: it relaxes the walls of your blood vessels and lets more blood flow through. Think of it like loosening a tight hose pipe so water can flow freely. Now, why does that matter for sexual and reproductive health? Because sexual arousal in both men and women is a blood flow event. In men, an erection happens when blood fills the erectile chambers of the penis. This process is triggered by nitric oxide. Full stop. Without adequate nitric oxide, the blood vessels don't relax. The blood doesn't flow in, and the erection either doesn't happen or doesn't last. And here is the part that most people don't know about erectile dysfunction medication like Viagra. It doesn't add nitric oxide to your body. It doesn't create arousal. All it does is slow down the enzyme that breaks nitric oxide down. It extends the life of a molecule your nose already makes. Your nose is the original source. The medication is the backup. In women, exactly the same thing happens. Nitric oxide governs blood flow to the clitoris and labia, drives vaginal lubrication, and makes physical arousal possible. The biology is identical. We just don't talk about it as much. So, here is the first and most direct connection. When you breathe through your nose, air passes through your nasal passages, picks up nitric oxide from your sinuses, and carries it into your blood. When you breathe through your mouth, the air bypasses your sinuses entirely. The nitric oxide doesn't get picked up. Your blood gets significantly less of it. Every time you breathe through your mouth instead of your nose, you are reducing your body's access to the very molecule that makes sexual arousal physically possible. And this is just the beginning. the tissue nobody told you about. Now, here is where this episode takes a turn that surprises almost everyone. Inside your nose, lining the inner walls of your nasal passages, there is a layer of tissue. And this tissue is biologically and structurally the same type of tissue as the erectile tissue in the penis and the clitoris. Same cell type, same blood vessel structure, same behavior. Your nose contains erectile tissue. It responds exactly the way genital tissue responds. It fills with blood, it swells, it cycles. And it does this in response to the same signals, hormonal shifts, nervous system changes, and sexual arousal. This correspondence is so consistent and so well documented that it has an actual clinical name in medical literature. It is called honeymoon rhinitis, nasal congestion triggered by sexual arousal and intercourse. The nasal tissue swells at the same time as genital tissue swells because they are made up of the same tissue receiving the same signals at the same time. This is not a quirk, it is biology. Your nose and your genitals share the same tissue type because they develop from the same area in the body before birth and they stay connected throughout your entire life. Think about what that means practically. When someone is a chronic mouth breather, the nasal tissue, which should be regularly stimulated by airflow, regularly cycling, becomes swollen and sluggish. The tissue that is supposed to be an active part of your body's arousal system becomes dull and unresponsive. You are not just blocking an airway, you are slowly desensitizing tissue that belongs to your reproductive system. The shared hormonal equation, your nose and your reproductive hormones. We have just seen that nasal tissue and genital tissue share the same structure, but it goes one step further. They also share the same hormonal management. The lining of your nasal passages has estrogen receptors and androgen receptors, testosterone receptors sitting directly in it. This means your reproductive hormones don't just govern your reproductive organs, they actively maintain the health of your nasal tissue too. Estrogen keeps mucous membranes throughout the body healthy, moist, and functional. The vaginal lining, the cervical lining, the uterine lining, and equally the lining inside your nose. Same hormone, same job, different location. This is why when estrogen drops in perimenopause under chronic stress, after months of hormonal disruption, women often notice nasal dryness at the same time as vaginal dryness. These are not two separate problems. They are one hormonal change showing up in the same tissue type in two different places. For men, testosterone receptors in the nasal lining mean that low testosterone also affect nasal tissue health. The mucosa becomes thinner, less moist, less robust. Now, here is the connection that I find most beautiful of all. Cervical mucus, the fluid that shifts throughout a woman's menstrual cycle, becoming clear and abundant around ovulation, is produced and governed by estrogen. Nasal secretions follow the exact same hormonal pattern. When estrogen peaks at ovulation, cervical mucus is at its most fertile, and nasal secretions are simultaneously at their most fluid and abundant. Both are estrogen driven, both peak together, both reflect the same reproductive moment in the body. The nose is not just structurally similar to genital tissue, it is part of the same hormonal system. When reproductive hormones are healthy, nasal tissue is healthy. When they decline, nasal tissue declines with them. And in part 2, we show what happens when this runs in reverse, when nasal tissue degrades and what that does back to the hormones. because this is not a one way relationship, it is a loop. And understanding that loop is what makes this whole picture complete. The reflex that science forgot and is now remembering. I want to take a moment to tell you a story because this is one of the most fascinating pieces of forgotten science I have ever come across. In the 1890s, a German doctor named Wilhelm Plees, who was a close friend of Sigmund Freud, made a series of unusual observations about his patients. He noticed that when he applied a numbing medicine to specific spots inside the nose during nasal procedures, some of his patients reported changes in sensation in their pelvic area. And he noticed the reverse too, that certain reproductive conditions seem to produce sensations and symptoms in the nose. He mapped the spots on the nasal lining and called them genital spots. He proposed that there was a direct reflex connection, a nerve pathway running between the nose and the genitals. He was largely ignored and dismissed. His idea got mixed up with the complicated politics of his friendship with Freud, and for much of the 20th century, his observations were buried. But the reflex he described never disappeared because it was always real. Modern research has continued to find it. We now know that the lining of the nose and the lining of the genitals both grow from the same area in the developing body. And because of their shared beginning, they stay in communication for life through blood flow, hormones, and the nervous system. Research has shown that the nasal tissue actually changes across the menstrual cycle, swelling and shifting in patterns that mirror what is happening hormonally in the reproductive organs at the same time. And neuroscience is now confirming what Flees documented over a century ago, that there are real nerve pathways connecting the nose and the pelvis, affecting blood flow and sensation in both places at once. The nose and the genitals are in conversation. They always were. We just stopped listening. The nerve hub inside your nose. Now we get to what I think is the most important piece in this entire episode. And I promise the name sounds complicated, but the idea is completely simple. Deep inside your nasal cavity, tucked behind the inner walls of your nose, there is a cluster of nerve cells, a nerve hub. Think of it like a Wi Fi router of your nervous system. Signals come in, signals go out to multiple parts of the body at once. This hub is called sphenopalatine ganglion. We will just call it as SPG. The SPG is the largest calming nerve hub in the entire head. It connects to your tear glands, your salivary glands, your nasal lining, and critically through nerve pathways that run all the way down into the pelvis to your reproductive organs, the uterus, the ovaries, the vagina, the penis. There is a direct nerve connection from inside your nose to your reproductive organs. Let me say that one more time, even more simply. Your nose and your genitals are connected by an actual nerve, not a metaphor, a real anatomical nerve pathway, and it runs through this hub inside your nasal cavity. This is not a theory. Doctors actually use the SPG as treatment point right now. They apply numbing medication to it through the nose to treat chronic pelvic pain, painful intercourse, and certain types of ongoing pelvic discomfort. The nose is the doorway to a nerve that governs your pelvis. So, what happens when you breathe through your nose? Every breath moving through your nasal passages gently stimulates the tissue around the SPG. That stimulation sends calming, opening signals down into the pelvic organs. Blood flow to the genitals is supported. Sensitivity is maintained. The whole pelvic system receives a quiet, continuous signal that it is safe to be open and responsive. When you breathe through your mouth, none of this happens. The air doesn't go through the nose. The SPG gets no stimulation. The signals to the pelvic organs reduce. Over years of chronic mouth breathing, this pathway becomes underactive, and the effects show up exactly where you would expect in reduced sensation, reduced arousal, reduced reproductive function. Not because anything is structurally broken, but because the nerve that regulates all of this is simply not getting the input it needs. 20,000 breaths a day, every one of them either activating this pathway or not. Your nose, your brain, and desire. One more connection before we close part one, and this one might be the most fascinating of all. Your sense of smell is completely different from every other sense you have. Sight, hearing, touch, taste, all of this send signals to a sorting area in the brain first. The area organizes the information and passes it along to the right place. Smell skips that step entirely. When you breathe in through your nose, scent signals travel directly with no middleman, straight into the emotional brain, the part that handles feelings, memories, and desire. This is why a certain smell can take you back to a memory in less than a second before your thinking brain even registers what happened. It is why the smell of someone you are attracted to hits differently than a photo of them. Smell is the most direct, most powerful trigger of desire of all senses because it has the shortest, most unfiltered route to the brain. And here is the reproductive health piece. That same smell pathway goes directly into the brain's hormonal control center, the area that manages ovulation, testosterone, fertility, and libido. Every nasal breath feeds information into this system quietly, continuously, below your conscious awareness. When you breathe through your mouth, this pathway is switched off. The signals don't arrive, and the most ancient, most direct route your brain has for processing desire simply goes dark. The yogis who say the nose is the gateway to prana, life force, were not being poetic. They were describing exactly this, a real physiological pathway that only works when air enters through the nose. The nose is not a breathing tube, it is a sense organ with a direct line to the most fundamental drives in human biology. Bringing it all together. Let me pull everything into one simple picture before we close. Here is a truth your body already knows. You cannot be fully aroused and fully stressed at the same time. Your nervous system has two basic settings. One is alert, heart rate up, body ready to handle a threat, everything on guard. The other is calm and open, body at ease, organs relaxed, blood flowing freely. Sexual arousal belongs to the calm setting. An erection, lubrication, desire, the relaxed pelvic floor that allows pleasure. These are all things that happen when the body feels safe, not when it is on alert. And every single mechanism we talked about today, the nitric oxide, the shared tissue, the nose genital reflex, the nerve hub, the smell desire pathway, every single one of them is switched on by nasal breathing and turned down by mouth breathing. Nasal breathing tells your body, we are safe, we can open. Mouth breathing tells your body, stay alert, stay defended. That message arrives 20,000 times a day with every single breath. So, here is the question I want to leave you with before part two. If nasal breathing, just breathing through your nose the way you were designed to, activates this entire system of reproductive and sexual health, then What has years of breathing through your mouth been quietly costing you? We answer that next week and we fix it. Thank you so much for listening to part one. If this episode made you see something differently, please share it. This information is sitting in anatomy research and neuroscience journals, and it just needs to be brought into conversation. Part two is next week. We go into what years of mouth breathing actually does to the system, including a two-way loop between your hormones and your nasal tissue that I think will genuinely surprise you. And we close with five practices you can start immediately, including one for during intimacy. I'll see you then. Breathe well and breathe through your nose.